So JonBenet was a child beauty pageant winner, and she was found passed away in the basement of her house on December 25th, 1996. And there are a lot of interesting details around this case. There was a ransom note that was found on the stairs by Patsy, the mother, early in the morning. However, it wasn't until much later that detectives decided that the father and a friend of the father should go and look around the rest of the house to see if everything was okay, and it was at that time that they found JonBenet. There are some other details that I will be going over at the end while I form my opinion as to who may or may not be guilty. For now, I'm going to be looking at and analyzing the microexpressions and gestures of the Ramsey parents on their first interview 7 days after the incident itself. I wanted to be able to go ahead and use as new and fresh a footage for their case as I possibly could, because that increases the likelihood of being able to tell if they're being honest or deceitful. Now, this specific interview was extremely hard to track down, and if it weren't for the work of another YouTube channel who had already gathered it from bits and pieces throughout various media sources to be able to compile what is considered the earliest footage of the Ramsey parents, I wouldn't be able to do this video today. So big shout out to them. They are linked in the description below. That being said, that's enough of a backstory. We'll talk more about it afterwards. I'm going to start doing the analysis itself.
When you return to Boulder, you will sit down with the Boulder police.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We want them to know everything possible.
Everything.
To help them.
Whatever they want, whatever anyone wants, we will cooperate.
Okay, right off the bat here, I'm going to talk about a couple things that I want to get out of the way. First, just quality-wise, this is not speaking of their nonverbal communication or anything. This is just the video. I apologize for the video quality. It's, like I said, from various media outlets, so the audio is absolutely terrible, and the video quality, you could tell where they've cut it and found it in different areas. However, it is the only footage I could find, so I apologize for the quality. Now, speaking on their nonverbal communication, there are a few things that I want to get out of the way. First, it does seem in this interview that Patsy, the mom, is sedated on some level. I would expect something along those lines. If I had just found out what they had found out, I would probably be sedating myself as well, just to put up with the trauma. But you will see that non-verbally with a lot of sluggish blinking and overall speech patterns. They just sound, for lack of a better word, sedated. John's, on the other hand, are a different story. He does not seem to have any sedatives in him, or at least not in a detectable way. Now, that being said, when they first ask this first question, both of them shake their head and blink their eyes. Now, those are two negative gestures to go along with a positive thing, so this could be seen as nonverbal misalignment. There are a couple ways that you could possibly interpret these. Either one, they are trying to block out deceit, or two, the head shake, which this is what I feel is the case in this specific instance. It's a "you wouldn't believe" or "there is no doubt." Those are the head shake thoughts that I am attributing to this specific gesture. Now, this gesture can mean deceit. It can mean nonverbal misalignment. However, I don't feel that is the case in this instance. And the eye blocking would be expected. Anybody who has been through this sort of deal could be seen doing any sort of blocking gestures just to emotionally separate themselves from the incident itself. But there's a lot to go through on this. We're going to keep watching.
Again, it's a mystery at this point. Do you truly think the perpetrator will be found?
So, talking about John here, Mr. Ramsey here, he does another sudden and very solid eye block right after saying yes, and then blinks his eyes. I'm not going to read too much into that. I do feel that that is just a blink here and not an eye block. So far, both of them are acting as you might expect. Let's continue compiling information before we can actually start forming some opinions.
You know, America has just been hurt so deeply with the tragic things that have happened. The young woman who drove her children into the water, and we don't know what happened with the O.J. Simpson, and I mean, America is suffering because they have lost faith in the American family. It didn't,
So that part, I'm not putting any weight to it because I didn't hear the question itself, and it's not applicable to the case. However, you can hear in this instance how slow Patsy's words are, how sedated she does sound, and this is constant throughout the entire interview, which does lead me to believe that she probably is on some sort of medication to be able to help cope with the stress and trauma, because this isn't existent in her other interviews, which I have watched to help establish the baseline that I'm working off of here. So I'm assuming that this is based off of sedatives, not based off of some odd psychological.
I couldn't read the whole thing. I just gotten up. We were it was the day after Christmas, and we were going to go visiting. And it was quite early in the morning, and I had gotten dressed and was on my way to the kitchen to make some coffee. And we have a back staircase from the bedroom areas, and I always come down that staircase, and I'm usually the first one down. And the note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads. And it was kind of dimly lit because it was very early in the morning. And I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, Mr. Ramsey. And it said, we have your daughter. And
I'm going to go ahead and pause real quick here as she's processing through what the note says. So during this time, her nonverbal communication is actually lining up with what I would expect and hope to see in an innocent person. She's not leaving out too many details, but she's also not just throwing in copious quantities of details that often will be seen in a time of a lie or deceit, all the way down to where she's looking as she recollects, to where she would be looking down the stairs at the note on the steps. Her gaze is matching along with that, so there's no misalignment. And all in all, what I'm getting from her is genuine recollection. This isn't a time of fabrication or falsification. This is genuine recollection down to the nonverbal side of things. However, this isn't nearly enough information to go off of, so we just have to keep working.
it just wasn't registering. And I may have gotten through another sentence like, we have your daughter, and I don't know if I got any further than that. And I immediately ran back upstairs and pushed open her door, and she was not in her bed. And I screamed for...
Okay, so real quick here, you can hear in her tone a lot of vocal frying. Now, this is common in multiple different instances. In nervousness, it's common in sadness, it's common in intense emotion in that arena, so this is also to be expected. Now, an argument could be made that this is nerves, perhaps she's lying. I don't believe that's actually the case here. From what I've seen, so far she's portraying exactly what I would expect her to portray.
The note asked for $118,000. Told the Ramseys to wait for a phone call.
We'd waited until after the time that the call was supposed to be made to us.
So while John is speaking here, a couple things on his baseline. His eyebrows are not very mobile. They stay in that general shape and position, and it does kind of give him an overall angry expression, and that's just part of his baseline. That's something that I'm taking into consideration as I read. And then along with that, he stays overall fairly composed throughout all of his interviews. There's not very many moments of actual emotion that have been shown, and that's important, and you'll see why in a little bit. But let's go ahead and keep really looking deep into what their body language is saying.
And one of the detectives asked me and my friend who was there to go through every inch of the house, see if there's anything that was unusual or abnormal that looked out of place.
Telling for clues.
He's asking us to do that more to give us something to do to keep our mind out. And so we started in the basement, and and we're just looking, and we have one room in the basement that when I open the door, there are no windows in that room, and I turn the light on, and I hope that
This is an important part of the video for a couple reasons. One, like I said, John is not very emotionally expressive, so this is a little tiny glimpse of possible emotion. And I had a battle with myself when I first watched this to tell if this was a genuine emotion or if it was false. And I landed on false, and there's one pretty sizable reason for it. During emotion, when you start to cry, and if you watch Patsy, for instance, because her emotion is what I feel to be genuine. When you watch her start to cry, she looks away and she keeps that way while she's handling the emotion until the first initial wave of it hits, and then she'll look up and try to compose and go. John does not do that. He has this sense of overwhelming emotion, and then he looks up and he flashes what looks to be considered duping or duper's delight. Now, this is not a guaranteed read. However, it was enough of a flash for me to see it and to consider it and to notice it as a red flag in this instance. This expression that he's showing here does not match with the intense sorrow that he was trying to conjure up before, and that leads me to believe that he is forcing the emotion before to be able to convince us of his sorrow. Now, there's the possibility that he is actually sorry. However, it's interesting that he has this emotion and then immediately looks up to verify that the person who is interviewing is seeing the emotion. That's the sign of a manipulator, not the sign of an innocent person. However, this is still not nearly enough to go off of, so we have to keep analyzing.
Okay. Well, he wasn't screamed, carried her upstairs. Patsy and I, Burke, her son, is 9. Every family member,
including your 2 elder children. Were you offended by that?
It was
So, also, you can notice how short-lived the pain is and how few remnants it leaves behind. So if you watch Patsy's face when she experiences pain, parts of it linger for a while. Her eyebrows convey pain, sometimes the corners of her mouth, and even her eyes will still convey pain after the initial burst of emotion. With John, you don't see that at all. His emotion is now gone again from his face. It was there for a teeny tiny moment, and then almost like it's a side thought for him, it just fades out of existence again. Now, I need to be very clear, people handle trauma very differently. So this could be his way of handling trauma. He might just need to shift into I need to be okay mode. However, this is a red flag for me as a nonverbal analyst and something that I'm absolutely going to keep track of throughout the rest of the video, because so far I'm not getting a lot of I did something from Patsy, but I am getting that from John. That's very interesting to me.
difficult, but, they need to know. I mean, our handprints are all over our home. So they need to know if there are other ones.
one of the things they told us, we had some initial reactions as to who might have been involved, and they said, "Oh, that's good, but we don't want to draw the focus in tight yet. We've got to look at everything."
An FBI spokesman was quoted as saying, at this point, they don't regard it necessarily as a kiss.
That sounds like kidnapping to me.
Interesting. The interviewer, from what I can hear from this pretty poor audio, is saying that the detectives don't think that this was an actual kidnapping, and she says that it doesn't sound like kidnapping to me, and he looks over at her as if to be like, wait, what? And then he looks down in what appears to be shame, and he doesn't often do this specific cluster, and that would line up with the idea that if John did something and he didn't tell his family about it, this would be a point of shame for him and very uncomfortable. So ergo the diverted gaze and the look down of shame. Once again, this is still just an early forming of an idea, not a hard, concrete conclusion.
What happened? Was this a true attempt to?
I don't know.
Yeah, right.
It makes no sense to me.
You believe it's someone outside your own.
There is a killer on. I don't know who it is.
So we're about to hear Patsy once again. You can hear the sedation in her voice. However, John does an interesting thing when they ask, is there somebody that's out on the loose? And he shakes his head and leans back and says, oh, and you know he's about to say, oh, of course. This could be considered as the earlier no shakes as a you wouldn't believe, but it could also be a distancing, blocking, and no shake of guilt. Now, with the extra information that we're considering in this, it could be considered as such, but I am only going to be using this as a possibility, not concrete for he's guilty. We need to keep watching, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
I don't know if it's a he or a she, but if I were a resident of Boulder, I will tell my friends to keep your baby close to you. There's someone else.
You can see on Patsy's face now, this is genuine emotion. And one of the big tells for that for me is the action underneath her eyes. A lot of the times when you see somebody about to cry and you're able to get close enough to see it, there will be some tenseness under here, under your eyes, as they begin to tear up. Right before, there will be tension underneath the eyes, and you see that here as the emotion hits and then the physical follows. So you could see it just push its way into her normal speaking, and then it's expressed across her entire face. It's not a misaligned expression, pain in her eyebrows, pain in her eyes, pain around her nose, and pain around her mouth. It's a constant expression. All of this is lending me towards her being genuine. Once again, during this entire time, John is pretty vacant. Just interesting.
I remember about her was that if I would frown, she would look at me and say, Dad, I don't like that face. And I'd smile and she said, that's better. And it's just the way she was.
She loved her daddy. She loved her daddy. She was daddy's girl.
Okay, interesting thing again on John's face. He has joy as he's talking about JonBenet back when she would interact with him, and then after the moment has passed, he has lingering expression on his face of joy. Interesting how that's sticking around while the much stronger expression of intense grief shifted away so quickly for him. That, once again, non-verbally, is suspicious to me. Now, as I said before, there was a ransom note that was lying on the stairs, and it was filled with all sorts of details, including some details about the author of the note themselves. Now, I'm not going to go deep into what the ransom note itself says because this is a non-verbal channel. However, it does have some interesting aspects about it. It mentions that it's from a small corporation, which you can rest assured if it says it's from a small group of people, it's not from a small group of people. It can't possibly be from a small group of people because that would be such an easy hint, so it has to be somebody else. Along with that, it has some phrasing and some details in it that are very specific to the Ramsey family, down to the amount of the ransom, which was the amount of the bonus that John was going to be getting that year. A very personal financial detail that wouldn't be shared among friends or family so often. So it's very personal. Along with that, its length indicates time. It's a 3-page ransom note, and it's not an emotionally driven one. It's a very logically written out one. All of these are interesting and not common in ransom notes. However, the handwriting itself is very interesting. Many people have looked at the handwriting of the note because that could be an excellent indicator as to who wrote it, and they found a number of matches with Patsy Ramsey. Now, the footage that I'm going to be looking at here in a second is based off of those findings. It's an interviewer asking Patsy Ramsey, do you recognize this handwriting compared to the ransom note. The handwriting given is hers. It's been proven to be hers compared to the ransom note, and there are similarities. Now, I posted a post asking you if you could see any similarities between two different groups of handwriting, two different columns, and I didn't say who it was or what case it was related to, but some of you knew what case it was related to, and many of you, not all of you, many of you said that you saw some very hard similarities between the two. And visually speaking, it's fairly undeniable, the similarities. However, the similarities were not forensically suitable, so they were not able to be used as hard evidence against Patsy. That being said, there are many different pages of comparisons, and I will let them play through here as I talk a little bit about why these might be so similar and how they could have been made to be so similar. Now, as you can see, a lot of these have very similar strokes, sizes, and overall style. And there's two main reasons that you would see variances in a person's handwriting. One, say a person is writing it and then they're stressed, that will show up in their handwriting. For instance, if you write a letter while angry, it will look different than when you write a letter while totally fine. So it could be an external stressor. It could also be the intention of the person writing the note to change the way they write to mask that it's them. That's the other possibility, and the variances and the similarities are literally where they failed to make their handwriting different. The other possibility on the flip side of this coin, say it's not the person who actually wrote it, it could be somebody trying to forge their handwriting in such a way that would implicate them. And the similarities that we see are literally the person who is forging the letter attempting to make it look like somebody else's, and the variances are because it's somebody else. They're two different people writing in the same style. Now, one of those has to be correct. It has to be one of those options. And we'll get to what I think here in a second, but let's go ahead and look at what Patsy Ramsey says about the similarities that I could arguably say exist fairly clearly.
I found a ransom note. I found my daughter missing from her bedroom, and several hours later, our daughter was found dead in our home.
And you don't feel it was a member of your own family? Is that correct?
No, sir.
That's
It
fine.
was not a member of my family.
That's an important question, and I'm not so certain here. Something has changed, so this is obviously a different timeline. This is different. This is further on in the future, not so raw. She's obviously not on sedatives in this one, and her body language is a lot more composed and collected. Now, she says that she doesn't think it's anybody in her family. However, when she says that I do not think it's anybody in my family, she has some odd head movements which just serve as a I should pay attention. However, since this isn't all compiled into one solid stream of video of her face, it grew pretty hard to pay attention to her face during that point. I honestly don't think that she does think it's somebody in her family. I think she thinks it's somebody outside the family. I hope that makes sense. But let's keep watching her reaction. Then it also has John's reaction as well, and that's important. And then at the very end, I promise, we're going to summarize this, and also something on Burke, the 9-year-old brother as well.
Mrs. Ramsey, I'm going to show you a document. I'd like you to look at it and take your time. And I'm going to ask you if you recognize the photograph. Can you identify any of the individuals in the photograph?
Just JonBenet.
Okay. I would like you to now look at the handwriting below the photograph. Do you recognize the handwriting?
Not particularly.
All right. Do you, so you say not particularly, you don't recognize this as being your handwriting, is that correct?
I don't remember writing it. So what you mean?
Verbally speaking alone, she's obviously lying. This is such an easy to see lie that it's not even worth really spending time on. She knows this is her handwriting, but she's in a tough position because I don't believe she wrote the ransom note. I'll get to why that is in a second, but if you put yourself in her position, she can see the similarities. Everybody can see the similarities. Even if they're small similarities, there are obvious similarities. I believe it was designed to be so. But she can't say that she sees them because that really kind of incriminates her. So she has to try to do these wishy-washy, waffly kind of answers to get around the question as best as possible. Eventually, she just has to outright lie and say she has no idea what it is. Let's keep watching.
I mean, I don't know. I may have.
All right, but do you recognize the handwriting as being your handwriting?
No.
Okay. Now we're going to go to another exhibit. Do you recognize any of the handwriting as being your handwriting?
Not particularly.
So you couldn't say with any degree of certainty that that was your handwriting?
No.
Mrs. Ramsey, what I'm showing you is a series of letters. And I'm not identifying their source. I'm just simply showing you a series of letters. I'd like you to look at them carefully. Can you, without knowing the source or where these letters are from, identify any of them?
No, sir.
No, sir. Yes, sir, is the answer that she should have given. And he says that he's not identifying any of the sources of it, but if you think about it in her shoes, what else would he possibly be referring to? I'm sure this isn't her first time in an interview like this, and I'm sure it wasn't her last time in an interview like this, but she knows exactly what this is about. So when she's lying about these things, it is an intentional lie. And along with that, it seems unreasonable to think that she cannot see similarities on some level to them. But there's more to this.
I'd like you to look at the letter B and tell me if those B's look at all similar to you.
Well, they're both lowercase b's.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything about the B's that to you look similar beside the fact that they're lowercase? The way they're drawn?
No, not particularly.
Okay, I'm going to ask you then to look to the letter above the letter that we've identified as B and what looks like it could be a G. And I'm going to ask you to look at the G.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to ask you whether or not you see any similarities between the G's and what those similarities are.
Well, they're both lowercase g. They're both more the same size than the b's are.
Mm-hmm. What about the way in which what looks like what could be described as a tail with the G? Is there any similarity with respect to that?
It swings to the left.
Right. Do they look similar, the tails to the G?
Somewhat. I mean, it's a G. You make a G with the tail to the left.
So as you can see, she's trying to answer this question in a way that doesn't incriminate herself. She's put in a very, very difficult position because it's undeniably similar. However, she cannot say it. And I don't believe that she is the one who did it. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward in this footage to get to the part where John is asked to look at the same letters and is asked the same questions. And I find this interesting.
Mr. Ramsey, I'm going to ask you to look at the document that's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 16 for identification, and I'm going to ask you if you recognize this document.
Yes, I believe I do.
Could you identify it, please?
Well, it appears to be a copy of the ransom note that we found in our home.
Does it look substantially like the ransom note that you saw that morning?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Now, Mr. Ramsey, I'm going to ask you to once again look at it, and I'm going to ask you if, in looking at it, whether or not you see any similarity between your wife's handwriting and the handwriting in the ransom note, you personally.
Absolutely not.
None at all?
No.
All right, so he immediately answers that there's no similarity at all, once again, despite there being obvious similarities. And then they ask him again, are you sure? You know, like, are you sure about this? Because look at it. And he says no, and his tone increases. He doesn't look up, but that's expected. He's looking at a piece of paper, but his tone increases and an eyebrows increase, and this is an inflection as if he's trying to really add an exclamation point to his words. No, I do not think they look similar at all. And he continues to go on through, and we'll look at that, and then we'll talk about all this at the very end, and then I'm going to wrap the video up.
Not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit.
Right. Now, Mr. Ramsey,
Patsy writes very neatly. She's a feminine writer.
right.
There's misspellings in the note. She graduated at the top of her class. She doesn't misspell words like business and possession.
Do you think the ransom note writer was trying to disguise their identity?
I've been told that that was the intent, but there are parts of it that where that's broken down. I don't know which parts, but
Do you think that maybe some of the misspelling may have been an attempt by whoever was writing this note to disguise their identity?
I don't think so, because I think they tried to be very articulate to the best of their ability. And the misspellings were because they didn't know how to spell those words.
Interesting that he would say it that way. How could one possibly know that? It could very well be what the interviewer just asked, is this somebody who was attempting to disguise their identity? And he says, no, I don't think so. I think it was probably really just somebody else who just couldn't spell normal words. So it's an interesting response that he gives here, and it really falls into place for the puzzle that I feel, according to the information that I have, fits best. We'll talk about that in just a second.
With respect to the sloppiness of the handwriting, do you think it's possible that the handwriting, the person who wrote this handwriting was trying to make their handwriting look sloppier than normal?
I don't know. It's very sloppy handwriting. I would agree with that.
Mr. Ramsey, were you ever told that Mrs. Ramsey could not be eliminated from any of the handwriting investigation being done by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation? Did anybody ever tell you that?
I was told that it was virtually certain that she did not write the note, but that there were some similarities which exist in all of our handwriting because we've all been taught the same. And that's how we communicate, is with the written language in English. But that because of these few similarities, she could not be absolutely eliminated, but it was highly improbable that she wrote the note. And that in fact, there were more dissimilarities in her writing than a number of other people that have been looked at.
Right. Do you know if your handwriting was examined by the law enforcement?
As far as I know, it was.
Do you know whether or not you were eliminated as the author of the note?
I was told that on a scale of 1 to 5, Patsy was placed at a 4.5 in terms of probability. In other words, a very low probability. Mine was a 5.
I'm going to ask you if you recognize, without naming anybody, any of the figures in that particular document.
I think I recognize 2.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you to look at the handwriting beneath the document, and I'm going to ask you if you recognize that handwriting.
I do not.
Could it be your wife's handwriting?
I don't recognize it. It doesn't look like Patsy's writing. It's sloppy. It's irregular. I would not look at that and say that's Patsy's handwriting.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it here, and here's some details that helped me be able to build the full picture that I have. Now, I want to add a disclaimer at this point. I am not saying that anybody in this video is guilty. I am simply giving you my opinion based on the facts that I have seen and what I have observed, and this has all created this sketch as to what I feel like the crime could have been. A few important details about this case that make it difficult lie in the ransom note and in the surrounding area. First, the ransom note includes verbiage throughout it, which if you go and read, like I said, tied directly to the family down to the amount of John's bonus for that year. That was the ransom amount. Who would have known that? Nobody knows. Why would it be specifically that number? Perhaps they guessed it. Perhaps they guessed it. That could have been it. It's always a possibility, but I don't think that's the case. That leads me to believe that somebody within the family that had knowledge about the family wrote that note. Close friend maybe part of the family. Now, a lot of people are interested in Patsy because, after all, the writing was really pretty similar to Patsy's writing, so everybody thinks that maybe Patsy did it. I don't think that's the case. I don't believe that Patsy did it. The grief that was showing on her face was genuine. It was actual pain. There was no oddities in her reactions on the earlier interview, the interview that had the most probability of showing genuine emotions. The other option is that perhaps John did something and Patsy helped cover it all up. And I also don't believe that's the case, once again, just due to the fact that Patsy just really didn't strike me as being suspicious or guilty. Another option is Burke, the 9-year-old brother. And he did an interview with Dr. Phil a little bit ago, and it was, to say the least, strange. It left me feeling very uneasy. However, I don't think he did it due to the nature of the crime itself. I don't think he could physically do it himself. But I might do a read on Burke, and that leads me to my conclusion. I feel that John Ramsey killed JonBenet. And the evidence that I have for that is not only his odd nonverbal communication during his initial first very early on interview, but also it makes sense with all of the facts. I'm not going to go into details as to what I assume the relationship with his daughter could have been, but if he even accidentally did something to harm JonBenet and perhaps killed her, then he would have to cover his steps, and he would have to do so in the time of one night, but not so quickly as an intruder would. It would allow him to have time to craft a note, perhaps a 3-page one, and it would take a very intelligent person to carry all of this out and do so well. And that led me to think, I wonder what John does. Well, it turns out during the time of this incident, he was the CEO of a tech company that he later sold to General Electric for a large amount of money. He was a very intelligent and calculating man, as most CEOs have to be, and also very quick thinking, as one has to be in those sorts of situations. I could see him accidentally or purposefully committing this crime against his daughter, JonBenet, and then crafting a note that would send investigators in all different directions, including towards his own family members, in order to disperse any attention directed towards him. And this would explain why he would be so quick to deny the similarities between the letters of the note and the letters of his wife's handwriting, because he knew it wasn't her handwriting because it was his. He made it look as if it could be somebody faking hers in order to cover up a crime that he did. From the very beginning, John is the only one who ticks all the boxes that I could find in this case. Now, obviously, there are more details than the public is able to obtain about cases, so there could be details that I am missing about John himself that perhaps excuse him from the entire thing. However, it is also convenient that he was the one who found JonBenet rather than Patsy, which would make any evidence that could be found against him part of him retrieving JonBenet. It all lines up for a clean and easy break for him, and statistically speaking, it would also make sense, as the father and husband was the guilty party of the crime. But let me know what you think. Do you think it was somebody else? Without further ado, that's all that I've got for the day. My name is Logan, and you have been oh so awesome, as you always are. And I will see you in the next video. Today's video is going to be centered specifically around her older brother, who was 9 years old at the time of the incident, but he came onto the Dr. Phil show in order to have this breaking interview. And a lot of people were very, very put off by his nonverbal communication. They found it to be very odd, and understandably so. So today I'm going to be analyzing that interview, talking about the nonverbal communication of it, where there are misconceptions, where people may be getting stuff right, and where there may be some secrets that we didn't know about before. As I continue to talk through the case, I will reveal more about my character sketch of Burke Ramsay himself. Now, I went through the entire long interview and took out certain points that I felt were important enough to be able to talk about on the channel here, and the ones that I felt really revealed the most to us as the viewer. So this isn't the full interview, this is my hand-selected portions of the interview. You are welcome to go and watch the full interview yourself if you would like. I have also linked that video in the description below, but for now, let's start the analysis.
When you look back, was Christmas like a really big deal at your house?
Yeah. Decorations in the yard.
I'm going to tell you what I'm looking for right now. This is a generic question. There's not a lot of weight behind it, so I am using this portion of the interview to establish what little baseline, nonverbal baseline I can of Burke. And for those of you who are watching and are new to nonverbal communication, if you don't establish a baseline, the read itself will become far less accurate as you're starting to rely on generalities rather than specific nonverbal patterns. So I am looking for an established baseline for Burke during this, but it is still very, very limited because there's very little footage of Burke interacting on a day-to-day basis that would allow me to have an established and reliable baseline. But this entire portion is going to be talking about his baseline, seeing how he acts on average questions so that we can compare it to how he acts on more intense or pointed questions.
Inside, my parents would throw a party every year.
Hello, I'm Handsome Ramsey. Daddy's right here, but this is JonBenet. She's 4, Until 7. Everyone to my little child. It was a very Merry Christmas.
Now, 2 days before JonBenet was murdered, that was when the party was at your house, right?
Yeah.
And you had people tour the house?
I think there was like a Boulder home tour thing. Like, we weren't the only people that did it.
Right. They went house.
I'm going to talk about something that I see that pops up in Burke's nonverbal communication the entire time. And when he is recollecting, when he's recollecting a genuine event, an actual memory, he consistently looks off to the side in this general area. That is his area of recollection. And he also has a slight squint to his eyes, which means that it is genuine recollection. That's important to note because if that pops up any other time, then we know he's genuinely recollecting. Whereas if there's a variance to that, that could be a sign of a fabricated memory, aka a possible lie. But that note, that pattern that we have made here is important to keep track of throughout the rest of the video. Also, a certain dynamic that I want to point out here that just starts to leak into my field of view, so to speak, is back here when Patsy is introducing Burke and JonBenet. You can see the favoritism that already shows up in her body language as she pays more attention to JonBenet, and Burke is a side thought. That dynamic is really important, and I'll get to that later on.
Yeah.
Looks all the decorations. So when do you guys open gifts? That Christmas Eve or Christmas morning?
Christmas morning.
Do you remember what you did that morning?
I remember peeking down. I remember seeing like an electric train and a bike, and I was super excited.
Was JonBenet with you?
I'm going to talk about something that everybody has noticed, and it's one of the reasons that this specific interview has been so highly requested for me to view, and that's this smile that Burke has on his face. This smile stays consistent throughout the entirety of the video except for maybe a few instances. But this consistent smile, this expression, remains on his face throughout the entirety of the video. And many people find that extremely unsettling, especially when it gets to more of the gruesome aspects of the case and the questions therein. He maintains this smile. I'll talk about why that smile is there in a little bit. For now, let's keep establishing this baseline.
Yeah.
Did she peek too?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Did you get what you had asked for that year?
Nintendo 64.
And what did JonBenet get?
I think she got a big dollhouse.
Something that I want to point out about Burke's tone is that when he's recollecting and unsure about something, his tone increases in both fragility and also pitch. So that is an indicator of a lack of confidence. So when he is not certain about something, those two tells are going to be prevalent in those instances. So if we see that specific tonal pattern pop up later on in an area where he's trying to sound very, very authoritative or confident in what he's saying, then we can understand that he is not actually feeling that confident. And that's the little blip that we had to work with. After this, the interview really started hitting hard with heavier questions. And so our baseline that we have for Burke, the very, very small one that we can have, is one, the smile is always there. It always seems to be there, but it's forced. That's important to know, and I'll talk about, like I said, a little bit later. And then also, when he's recollecting, he looks off to the side in the same way every single time. So if we see a variant from that, it's a red flag. Along with that, his uncertainty tells are an increased pitch level and fragility in tone. These are all things that we can keep track of as we continue on in the read, because they can be more or less open doors for us to understand what Burke's mental processing is throughout the entirety of this video.
You're 9 years old and your mother comes in the room in seemingly the middle of the night because it's dark and says, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" And then runs out of the room, and you just lay there, as opposed to getting up and going out and saying, "What's going on?" And then a police officer comes in your room, which I assume is the first time in your entire life that a police officer has come in your room with a flashlight looking around, and you still just stay in bed.
To be fair, I didn't know it was a police officer. It's just kind of...
But somebody comes in your room with a flashlight, and you never get up and say, "What is going on here?"
I guess I kind of like to avoid conflict, or I don't know. I guess I just felt safer there.
Were you curious?
Okay, so right off the bat, let's talk about a few things that are popping up. First, Burke has some extraneous fidgeting, common in nerves. Not going to be really focusing on those. So the finger fidgeting and some of the hand fidgeting that you'll see, there's also times where he shifts his position. These are all tells of nerves and would be expected in just about any nationally televised interview. No big deal. The things that are really interesting to me is that, one, he still keeps that grin, that smile across his entire face pretty consistently. Earlier on, there's not as much, and then as his nervousness ramps up, as the pressure ramps up, so does this expression of perhaps joy. It's not joy. I will let you know that it's not joy, but this expression pops up more and more frequently. And while he's recalling, he still has the tonal tells that indicate that he's not completely confident in the words he's saying. Now, is that because it's 20 years ago and he's remembering a very long time ago? Or is it because the events that he's recollecting are not genuinely the events that happened? I promise I am going to get to that smirk, that smile, and the reason for it, but it is going to be later on in the video because I feel like it's more important to cover it later than early on.
I'm not the worry type. I'm not the... I guess part of me doesn't want to know what's going on.
Critics would say you weren't curious because you already knew. He didn't have to get up and go check because he knew exactly what had happened.
I was scared, I think. I mean, I didn't know if there's some bad guy downstairs my dad was chasing off with like gun, or, I had no idea.
So again, that tonal variance comes in. I had no idea. And people are suspect of Burke's actions. And to be very, very valid, Burke's actions in this situation are strange. And I do believe that there's a specific reason for why that is. Let's keep watching throughout this so we can see and continue fleshing out this nonverbal character sketch as to who Burke Ramsay is and whether or not he's guilty.
Were you scared for JonBenet yet?
I think I was trying to be positive.
So this one was just a little blip because Dr. Phil asks an important question. Were you scared for JonBenet? And he says, I think I was trying to be positive, which in essence is answering the question, no, I was not scared for JonBenet. I wasn't. I was trying to be positive. I think I was trying to be positive. There's not any verbal confidence in that, so I have no confidence in that. What I am getting and what I am confident in is that he was not scared for JonBenet, and there's a reason for that.
The next thing I remember is going to another one of our friends' houses. Everyone was really sad over there. My dad came in to me, JonBenet is in heaven now. And he started crying. I started crying.
A few things that I want to point out non-verbally is, once again, this intensified grin, smile, expression of joy on his face throughout the entirety of this more or less tragic recollection. People are wondering, why is this so disconnected? And I'll go ahead and talk about that right now because it shows up throughout the entirety of this interview, and I might as well get this out of the way right away. This smile is not duping delight. It's not joy, and it's not happiness. It's forced. It's a forced expression. If you look, his smile stays the same. His expression stays the same, except for he's talking and moving around, but the expression itself stays the same. Now, emotions do not last that long. Emotions last a very short amount of time, and his expression is staying consistent. And what this means to me is that this is not an expression of joy, happiness, or duping delight, because all of those would be a much shorter expression. This is a defense mechanism that Burke has. His nervousness is pushing him to force this odd, smiling expression throughout the entirety of this interview. So when you see this smile, I know it feels off. It feels wrong to you. You feel like he should be frowning or crying or showing distress on his face, but instead he's grinning like he's talking about some really cool hobby of his that he really enjoys, where in realistic terms he's talking about the death of his sister. So you feel like that's wrong. And I understand, but non-verbally speaking and psychologically speaking, that specific display, that display of a grin, especially in times of morbid circumstances, is neither unheard of, nor is it uncommon. People will often laugh in times of pain and suffering, and likewise, they will smile in times of nervousness. So this is Burke's display of intense nerves. All the way throughout this interview, he's extremely nervous. So when you see it throughout the rest of this interview, it's more or less having to be disregarded. Now keep in mind that there can be variances from it. There can be nonverbal spikes from that specific little concept, that baseline tell of nerves that we've established. It can vary. And during those moments, it's important to note it. But for the rest of it, even when you really feel like, he should be sad looking right now, you can't, because his nerves are overriding his other emotions right now. And it's showing via a smile. So I'm very sorry if you saw this and you saw him smile and you were like, he's guilty. That's not enough right now. It's simply not enough.
How did you feel seeing her?
A lot of sadness. I don't think I really fully grasped, like, after this, I won't see her again.
I don't believe that he felt that at all. He said a lot of sadness and he avoids eye contact. There's nervous fidgeting off to the side, which is still part of his pattern of nerves just due to the interview. But long story short, I simply don't buy it right now. And there's not enough solid evidence for me to say for sure that he wasn't sad, but he doesn't display any nonverbal affirmative actions for that. So I'm making a note of that and I'll keep track of it. And if there's anything that goes against that later on, then I'll have to change this. I just have to, because that's how scientific method works. You discover new data and you change what you have to fit the new data. So let's keep watching.
Are you aware of these different theories that are out there? Theories that you killed your sister, theories that your mother killed JonBenet, and theories that an intruder killed JonBenet. Those seem to...
A little bit of frustration that's showing that he's heard these theories and he's frustrated by them. He's also looking down, more or less averting his eyes from Dr. Phil, and this can also be seen as an expression of shame. So the chances are he's both heard them, he's frustrated by them, and he's ashamed of those theories as well. That's what his body language is telling me, and that's likely how his train of thought is flowing from what I see nonverbally.
Be the three camps that people talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we were suspects. I didn't know they were camps, I guess.
He has his continual smile. It's still there. It's still prevalent, but he showed no other nonverbal misalignment. And that means that he's telling the truth, more or less, in this part. He has been aware of the theories, and he didn't know that there were camps or whatever. This is just showing that we have a decent idea as to the authenticity tells of Burke at this point, but we'd still need to gather more data for this.
Does that look like her handwriting?
Honestly, looking at that, she would always bug me about having good handwriting, and she would like make me rewrite stuff to try to get me to have good handwriting, and I think it's too sloppy.
So during this portion, this is about the ransom note. The ransom note that was left in the Ramsey household in regards to JonBenet was 2.5 pages, but 3 pages long. A very long ransom note. I went and I did a lot of research to see what was the average length of a ransom note. Just more or less, what's the average length? Now, obviously, there's no template, but from what I found on the average of them, they're most of the time very short, under a page. So to have a 3-page ransom note, that was odd. You can go and watch my other video to see what I think around that, but I just find it odd that if there were an intruder, they took the time to find a pen and paper in the middle of the night after doing this terrible crime to write out a very long and personally detailed ransom note that's 3 pages long in the middle of an adrenaline rush after doing an intense crime. It just does not make sense. It's usually pretty straightforward. We have dot, we want dot. That's usually how it goes. But with this one, there's so much extra detail that doesn't need to be there. There's so many red herrings, odd word choices, and the handwriting is undeniably similar to Patsy's handwriting. I said before, I don't believe it was actually Patsy's handwriting, but it's undeniably similar to it. So with both John and Burke denying these similarities between that, that's suspicious to me because you and I can see clearly that there are similarities. Also, during this time, Dr. Phil asks a specific question, does this look like your mother's handwriting? And Burke starts to have some positive spikes in his nonverbal communication in the form of nervous laughter consistently throughout his answer. He doesn't have this nervous laughter often, and it shows up in a large pile here. Along with that, he doesn't directly answer the question, and these sorts of tells push me to believe that he knows it looks similar, but he knows that he should not say that it does. So he tries to circumvent the question. He has nervous laughter, which is a spike in his nonverbal communication, and all of it lends me to believe that he knows it looks similar, but he won't say that it does.
You cannot recall a time in your life that you ever saw your mother fly into a rage.
No.
Did you ever see her throw anything?
No.
Did you ever see her break anything in a fit of anger, smash anything down?
No.
Dishes, lamps,
No.
throw anything at your father?
No.
All right, so during this time, Burke's being genuine. His body language is synchronized. There's nothing that's sticking out to me as a possible red flag. Even the lip compression at the end is easily related to the negativity of the questioning itself. But his head shakes are all synchronized. He doesn't break eye contact in his way that he does when it's more suspicious. And he has none of the tonal variances that show his lack of confidence. During this time, Burke seems to be, non-verbally speaking, being genuine. I don't think Patsy was a violent person. I just don't believe she was. And Burke's nonverbal communication goes to show that further.
Did you feel left out of that, or was that okay with you?
No, it's totally fine. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my mom too.
Don't buy that part. And this is where I'm going to talk about that dynamic that I saw earlier. And then at the end of this, I'll talk about how it all plays in together. Dr. Phil asks Burke, were you jealous of the attention that JonBenet got? And Burke answers in something that sounds not only hollow, but also the verbiage of it itself really indicates the true emotion of it. So Dr. Phil says, are you jealous, more or less? And Burke shakes his head and says, it's totally fine. I got to spend time with mom too, you know. He has this nervous laugh in there. And that indicates to me that he wasn't totally fine with it. He just wasn't. And very rarely are kids totally fine with one child getting more attention and more preferable treatment than themselves. It's very rare. So when Burke is saying, no, it was totally fine, I don't buy that. His body language doesn't lend me to buy that either. My theory, from what I can see so far, is that Burke did not like JonBenet's specific amount of attention that she got. He also didn't like JonBenet herself very much. There are many instances of Burke's lashing out at JonBenet, going so far as to even hit her in the face with a golf club out of anger. He often smeared feces in JonBenet's bed, and there is this history of hostility between Burke and JonBenet, and I feel that this is entirely the fault of John and Patsy Ramsey for showing clear and evident favoritism between the two, and I will tell you why that's important later on.
Both say there was a voice at the end of the 911 call, and that your voice was heard saying, "What did you find?" Did you speak those words?
No.
Were you there when that call was made?
No.
So you were not there and you did not speak those words.
That's correct.
That part I don't believe as much, and it's largely to do with his eye contact. Now, I need to make something super clear to you. The eye contact thing with lying is not a universal thing. If somebody's maintaining eye contact, if somebody's looking all over the room, that's not a universal thing. It's not like, oh, if they're looking everywhere but your eyes, they're lying, or if they're only looking in your eyes, they're lying. It's specific from person to person. From what I'm seeing with Burke, he maintains eye contact during points of authenticity. That is his tell, his specific nonverbal tell. But when he has instances like these, where he's asked very pointed questions, and his authentic tell is to maintain eye contact, my question is, why is he looking all over the room, looking down, looking away, and not looking at Dr. Phil during this moment? If he's being honest, and he has shown that he has the proclivity and the potential to maintain eye contact during stressful and intense questioning, why is it now that he's not? And chances are is that he's not telling the truth here. Now, this isn't enough to say that he's not telling the truth. I'm not actually sure if he was there or on that recording, but I am pushed towards him being there and on that recording, just based off of his nonverbal communication. But we'll talk a little bit more a little bit later.
So you can say with absolute certainty that is not your voice on that 911 tape.
Absolutely not.
Still not making eye contact, and absolutely not is another one of those verbal patternings, like the, oh, it's totally fine, it's over the top. It's not needed, but it's still implemented in there because Burke feels that he has to convince Dr. Phil of this, which can be said for his innocence. If he was innocent and he wasn't there, then he needs to convince Dr. Phil because he indeed was innocent. But if he's lying, he still has that need to convince Dr. Phil because he wants the lie to be bought. And with his eyes being turned down the way they are, and we know more often than not he will hold eye contact during authentic conversation and responses, then that lends me once again to believe that that might not have been true. Is it enough evidence? By all means, no. But that is the direction that I'm being pushed.
You went to see a child psychologist. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's an important thing just to know in Burke's character. So Dr. Phil says you went and saw a child psychologist, correct? And Burke flashes a very telling expression of contempt. Now, contempt shows up when a person is feeling like they are morally or intellectually superior to the concept, the discussion, or the person they're talking to, or about, so on and so forth. And Burke shows that in relation to the child psychologist, he feels intellectually or morally superior to that entire concept. The child psychologists themselves, maybe, the idea of going and seeing a child psychologist, he feels like he was above that. That usually is an indicator of the person having more information. When somebody flashes contempt, they have more information on it. So when Burke is flashing this contempt about the child psychologist, he knows something else that we don't know. That's what we can get from that. That's important, and I'll tell you why in just, I swear, it's just a tiny minute. This little video clip is almost done.
Did you hit your sister over the head with a baseball bat or a flashlight?
Absolutely not.
So during this part, very important question, right? He's asked if he more or less did the crime himself to JonBenet. And he shakes his head and says, absolutely not, looks away. So we have some conflict here. On one hand, his body language is synchronized with the no and the no, the head shake and the no, but he also has his look away and the extra emphasis on the word absolutely. And those two have been shown to be signs of possible deceit in the past. Now, I don't believe that Burke did it. I'll tell you why in a second, but I do believe that there was hostility from Burke towards JonBenet, so he doesn't feel the remorse that we'd expect to see, and that could be lending towards this nonverbal misalignment that we're seeing. There's one last little blip here, and then we're going to summarize.
If someone in your house did, do you think you would have heard it?
Probably. Yeah.
Now comes the part where we're going to talk about my interpretation and my opinion of the case and the theory I have. My theory still stands that John did it. I still believe that John was the culprit. There's a few reasons, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the family dynamic of the Ramsays, specifically in relation to JonBenet and Burke and the parents. So, John Ramsay, the father, he came from a military family. In military families, discipline is very, very common. It's more common to see discipline in a military family than it is to not. Is that a hard-cut rule? No. But it is a generality that has some evidence to back it up. So if we take that information, knowing that John came from a military family, he appreciated discipline, likely. Also, he was the owner of a company, a CEO, and as we have seen in his video, emotionally distant. Even Patsy had enough issue with it that it became a conflict in their marriage that John was so emotionally distant. I feel like that was a theme. Not only was John a disciplinarian, but he was emotionally distant. So his relationship to his kids was not as strong. That left Patsy Ramsay. Now, Patsy Ramsay was put in a tough position because she now really has the pressure of not playing favorites with her kids. Because John's out of the picture because he's a detached businessman, so Patsy Ramsay has to fill both shoes. And she should have treated JonBenet and Burke equally. We know that's not true. Not only is there the small, little, tiny, take it with a grain of salt evidence that we saw at the beginning with the specific concentration on JonBenet that Patsy showed in the Christmas side and the off-putting side for Burke, but then JonBenet was involved in pageantry. So was Patsy. Patsy was always working with and traveling with and being involved with JonBenet. Where did that leave Burke? More or less without attention from either parent, not from his distant father and not from his mother who doted upon her daughter, on JonBenet. And when a child is secluded so intensely in their own family, hostility is not only common, but almost expected. And that showed up. We saw physical evidence. We know that Burke had hostility towards JonBenet. Burke also had some aggression issues. He had some behavioral complications, and that was often directed at JonBenet. And my reasoning is that Burke had no interest in his sister. He was bitter towards her. And many of us could understand why. He was bitter of his younger sister, who got all of the attention from Patsy, which was all of the parental attention that there was to have because John was so detached. So Burke did not care what happened to JonBenet. So during these times where we're seeing this lack of empathy, this lack of care, it's not because Burke was a murderer. I still don't think he was. He doesn't fit the type. He could have, absolutely, he could have, and it could have been a cover-up from both the parents on Burke's behalf. It could be that. He even showed later on in his psychological evaluation when he was a child that he had more or less put JonBenet out of sight, out of mind, within 2 weeks of JonBenet being announced dead. 2 weeks. He did not care that JonBenet was where she was. He did not care that she was dead. He did not like JonBenet. So when you're watching Burke and you see his smile and you see his detachment, if you understand the family dynamic behind that, the possibility of Burke being a neglected child in this family and having everything doted upon, attention, time, effort, energy being doted upon JonBenet, because JonBenet is so close to Patsy Ramsay when she was a girl that obviously Patsy's going to dedicate more time to JonBenet. If you look at it in that light, you see a very wounded, neglected, and angry child, one who could not care less if his younger sister, who was the source of all of his jealousy and his anger, was gone. Now, there's so much evidence that's around this case. There's so many fine details. There's so many dynamics that I would be able to spend years on this case, and I still feel would not have a concrete, beyond a shadow of a doubt, conclusion. There's all of these possibilities, and to be fair, they have a lot of validity to them. But this is what I've seen non-verbally, and this makes the most sense to me in their behavioral patterns. But let me know what you think. Like I said, there's evidence for either direction on this, and I would love to be able to hear what you say. That's all that I've got for the day. My name is Logan, and you have been oh so awesome, as you always are, and I will see you in the next video. Burke Hamilton Ramsay was born on January 27th of 1987 in Atlanta, Georgia, and is the brother of the late JonBenet Ramsey, who was mysteriously murdered on December 25th of 1996. While the case still remains unsolved, there are a myriad of theories centered around who the culprit might be and what their motivation might have been. While there have been a host of complications during the case, including omitted or unreliable evidence, law enforcement malpractice, contradicting expert testimony, and the list goes on, many who are still avidly searching for the guilty party find it rather difficult to turn their gaze to anyone outside of the immediate family or very close friends due to the evidence that was made publicly available. As I mentioned before, I have already done videos on the parents, John and Patsy, and also of Burke many years after the incident. Though after all of the research that I've done into the case, I'm also led to believe that the culprit must be indeed one of the immediate family or close friends. My opinion as to who of those people is possibly guilty has possibly shifted a little bit since I last spoke on the case. To give a light refresher of the case and to clue you in as to where I'm kind of starting from, I'll give you a quick and partial summary of some of the details of the case itself. In JonBenet's autopsy, it was revealed that though she was killed via strangulation, she also suffered head trauma and had undigested pineapple in her system. According to Patsy Ramsay, Burke had been eating one of his favorite snacks, which was pineapple with milk and tea, while JonBenet slept upstairs the night before she was found. Theories state that JonBenet possibly went downstairs and took a piece of Burke's pineapple. This act may have triggered Burke's anger, leading him to pick up a nearby flashlight and strike JonBenet on the head, accidentally killing her. Along with this, Burke's behavior both before and after JonBenet's murder suggests that he might possibly be responsible. FBI Special Agent Jim Clemente noted that Burke had a history of scatological problems. These issues manifested in Burke leaving excrement around the Ramsey house. Linda Hoffman Pugh, the family's former housekeeper, reported that Burke was known to leave feces on JonBenet's bed and smear it on the walls in the home. When crime scene technicians examined JonBenet's room, they found feces smeared on a box of candy she had received for Christmas. Burke's anger problems also point to his potential involvement in JonBenet's death. According to a family friend, Burke was easily angered and had once even struck JonBenet with a golf club in a fit of rage, leaving her with a scar on her face, though both parents attempted to excuse this as an accidental incident. That being said, this incident demonstrates that Burke was capable of being violently aggressive towards his sister, and that the parents were willing to alter a narrative to protect their child, at least to a certain extent. Burke's responses during his investigative interview, which we will be looking at today, were interesting and seemed not to reflect typical emotions for a child who had experienced what he had recently experienced as he had experienced it. 2 weeks after the murder, Burke told investigators that he felt pretty safe and wasn't worried about the intruder returning for him. Again, the same former FBI profiler, Jim Clemente, described these feelings as very unusual for a child, elaborating that it's expected for a child to feel scared and unsafe after an intruder has taken and murdered their sibling in their house. Burke's calm demeanor suggests that he might have possibly known that there was no intruder, further implying that JonBenet's killer was somebody within their house. Evidence also showed Burke asking his father where JonBenet's body was found, which was seen as an unusual question for a 9-year-old. prior evidence from related cases suggests that a child would be more concerned with what happened to their sibling rather than the location of the body. When asked how JonBenet died, Burke physically demonstrated somebody either stabbing her with a knife or hitting her with a hammer or similar object, which, again, Clemente pointed out as odd because most children wouldn't want to reenact something like that. Throughout the earlier interviews, Burke showed little to no emotion about his sister's death, and signs of experiencing recent trauma were nearly non-existent. This again raised questions in many people's minds as to the level of his possible involvement. In a follow-up interview, Burke continued to display complex emotions in regards to the time of the incident. When asked if he had heard anything the night his sister died, he responded, "I always sleep real deeply, and I could never hear anything." Clemente also remarked that this response seemed exaggerated and possibly deceptive, continuing to say that if Burke were innocent, there would be no reason for him to oversell this response. Additionally, Burke displayed extreme discomfort when asked about a photo of the dining room table with a cup of pineapple from the day of the murder. Clemente observed that it seemed as though Burke was avoiding a very simple question and looked like he was about to more or less just jump out of his seat. Burke's reaction to the pineapple photo went to even further raise suspicion of his complicity. Burke's history of scatological and anger issues before the murder, combined with his atypical emotion and suspicious behavior after the murder, lead many to feel strongly about his involvement in his sister's death. So, with all of this in mind, with people messaging me in, requesting me to take a look, if possible, at some of these earlier interviews, I have done my best to find any compilation or gathering of these interviews that I might be able to take a look at. And that's what we've landed on today. Now, a few things to give you a heads up on. One, it's like an interrogation room interview quality. So it's extremely horrific quality. We will not be able to see his face very clearly, meaning that a lot of the micro expressions that we might see there are going to be null and void. They don't exist. Along with that, the video quality isn't the only terrible quality. The audio was also next to impossible to understand and hear. So I did as much as I could to clean up and edit the audio to where we can hear it at least somewhat, but it is pretty rough. All of those things being said, I think that that's enough of the disclaimers and backstories and everything along those lines. We'll talk about stuff as we see it. Let's go ahead and just dive right in.
So, what'd they tell you about why they wanted you to come talk today?
She is the kind who, you know what?
Sure.
Well, let me tell you a couple things. First, my job is partly to get to know you as best as I can. Make sure that you're okay, because things are kind of been hard for you around. Are you going to school?
Okay, so as you can see already, this is hugely cut up. If you're watching this and you're like, oh, I actually know exactly where to find this, please let me know. I can't find the solid interview, interrogation, whatever you want to call this scenario. I cannot find a solid footage of it. It's all cut to bits and very difficult to be able to piece together. There are areas where frames are dropped. There are cuts in there, and you could see even in timestamps, there are discrepancies in the timestampage of things. We're working with some fairly, I don't know, for lack of a better term, turbulent source footage, but we'll do what we can with that. Even at the very beginning here, Burke is showing reluctance to mention the act of his sister being killed by actual terminology. He refers to it as you-know-what. So there is a level of psychological separation from those two, but he has a little giggle in there, and he's also eating some food and having some snack, which I have to give credit to the psychologist that's in the room with him, because she's doing a good job at trying to make him feel safe, which a person who feels safe is more likely to be genuine and honest with what they say and display. If somebody's feeling like they're under attack already, a lot of that is going to shut down. So she's doing a good job at making Burke feel safe for this little interview that is being carried out here. So we'll continue to watch through this. We'll see some of these hot topic points that the various agents talked about that were suspicious. We'll see if we could see anything along with those, but let's continue.
No, because I'm trying to stay away from the grass. My friend said that after school, there's always mean people waiting there. Hello, did you see Burke in class today? No, I did not. I think he was absent. Oh, thanks. They go with it. So do you feel like you're pretty safe? Yeah. Yeah? You ever worry about it? Not really. Don't? We should just join Nintendo. Yeah, any secrets, do you think?
Okay, so a few things that we want to know about Burke's interaction here. He is fairly performative. He has a little bit of nervous energy in there as he's giving this little story. But again, he's maintaining, even at this childlike state, he's maintaining open nonverbal communication. He's not closing up. He's not showing any overt actions of fidgeting. Again, there's a large dropped portion of the footage, so it's a frozen frame, making it very difficult. But even while we're listening to some of these things, he's not sitting there feeling like he has to really weigh his words when asked about whether or not he feels safe. And that is what led Agent Clemente to believe that perhaps this wasn't actually a situation that Burke was ever at risk in, because in fact he was maybe complicit in it. So that's one of those areas that immediately popped up there. And to be fair, that is an interesting aspect of this case, is that Burke handled everything very nonchalantly very shortly after the actual incidents themselves, also showing little to no emotional reflection of the loss of his sister, which if you've watched the other videos, which again I suggest you do if you want some more the context behind this, it was fairly established that Brooke had a decent amount of jealousy towards JonBenet due to the parental attention discrepancy. His mom paid a lot of attention to JonBenet because she was in the beauty pageants and was more or less a smaller version. JonBenet was more or less just a smaller version of Patsy, so there was some favoritism in there, which Burke, having anger issues and jealousy, it could have made a potentially explosive concoction there. Let's continue.
I probably do. Yeah, I don't really know. Yeah. If I did remember any, I don't think I'd tell you. Why not? I'm a good person to tell secrets too. Because they're secrets. But things changed at your house a lot?
So when a child is young, they're less likely to want to overtly lie about things if they've been told that they shouldn't do those things. So even in areas where they do start to lie about something or they want to lie about something, there will be a lot of uncertainty and insecurity in those statements. So where the psychologist asks, do you have any secrets? His immediate response is, I probably do, which everybody does have secrets, but wanting to admit that very overtly and cleanly could feel iffy if he's possibly complicit in this crime. So with that level of uncertainty with that response, and then he's saying, but I wouldn't tell you anyways because they're secrets, it's just letting us know that at very least he's consciously able to keep these secrets about things, although there will be some level of that insecurity seeping out around, even just verbally. Again, we're seeing a fair bit of movement with Burke. It's not showing any repetitive movements as far as agitation being soothed down, so self-soothing gestures. It just seems to be perhaps a child that has some nervous energy, sitting in an unfamiliar room, being fed various snacks and having some games and talking to somebody who's being very kind to them. It doesn't right now show very overt agitation in regards to anything specific. That does shift a little bit as time goes on. Again, sorry for the quality of this. It is what it is. Let's continue.
A lot? A lot, yes. Yeah, let's change. Well, yeah, well, police have it locked up and stuff. Well, what about for you and your parents? Okay. You have parents who sometimes cry. Yeah. But, I mean, basically just got on with Bella and, Wait, it happened.
I'm going to go ahead and pause here. So this is another aspect that people found fascinating. Again, we're not seeing any overt self-soothers from Burke during this time. Sorry if in this video I end up accidentally calling him Brooke. It has attempted to escape my mouth like 5 times so far, so if that slips in there, my bad. His name's Burke. Sorry, but Burke here, he's still not showing any nonverbal indicators of self-soothing or needs to calm agitation down, but the way that he's responding to these questions is fascinating, even just lending to the psychology behind it. The things that are different that he's mentioning is very external things. the police are doing some things. The stuff outside of stuff is going differently. It's all different in that way, but doesn't really seem to want to mention anything inside. Then when pushed a little harder, he mentions, yeah, my parents seem to be pretty sad, but I just kind of want to play my video games and do my own thing, which doesn't lend towards him having a level of grief about the loss of his sister. Now, the argument could be made that since it was so fresh, perhaps this is his way of coping with trauma, is that he just shuts down and he wants to submerge himself into video games, into other worlds that don't have anything to do with his home life right now, because it's a tragic situation that a child is being placed in the middle of or finds himself in the middle of. So there is that distinct possibility as well, as we're trying to weigh out what's his processing during all of this. Let's see if we can find out.
I know what happened, do you know? Or when she got killed. How do you think that happened? So, I think, well, I asked my dad, I'm going to see if they buried her body, and my dad said I found it down in the basement, and so I think that someone...
So that's that instance where the agent was referring to him asking his dad. I asked my dad where they found the body, which again is a fascinating thing. If an adult had said something along those lines, then there would be a lot of suspicion pointed at that adult for saying something like, where'd you find the body, before it was established that there was a full crime scene, there was a body, or even just wanting to specifically mention that. And so that's another instance where it seems as though there's the possibility that Burke might have some level of knowledge of the circumstances around JonBenet's death that even the interviewer here doesn't know. So Burke is going to now continue explaining what his whole questioning around the situation is and what he thought may have happened. Let's watch.
Took her very quietly and towed down the basement. And then maybe he took a knife out. No, sorry, that. Or I think that's how she died. Or maybe a hammer head will be. So what did your parents tell you about?
All right, so that's the area then again where he is now play acting and acting out this whole scenario of what happened to his sister. From other cases, it wasn't as common for children to want to do something along those lines because it's a triggering thing to act out the murder of somebody in general, but especially when you're acting out the murder of a very close familial relative from that short time ago. So that again lends towards this at very minimum a psychological disconnect between Burke and his sister JonBenet, which, as we've already established, there was a substantial amount of jealousy in between the two, and there were some anger issues, and all in all, there was a fair amount of disharmony between the two siblings in this family group. And what other people have pointed out, which may be covered here in the video, is that Burke's response to people having an overt amount of conflict in the house was to maintain his state of staying in bed. He didn't want to get out. He didn't want to explore. He didn't want to ask questions, even though he does admit later on to being very curious, to wanting to find things out, to wanting to know things. And if he doesn't know something, his response is to go and try to find it out. In an area where there's that possibility of that being able to be done, he says that he stays in his room and just assumes that somebody's going to come and tell him. That sparked all sorts of debate online, with people being like, oh, well, that's pretty normal for kids to want to just stay in their room if something seemingly scary is happening. They want to stay in the safety of their bed. And that does make sense. And so with that little aspect of things, with him staying in his bed during that time, I can't really hold too much weight to that as far as him possibly being guilty or not, because many people are correct. A lot of children at that age, if there's something stressful happening in their household, they won't likely get up and try to see what it is or address it or fix it or anything along those lines. Some will, but many won't. And so the fact that he stayed in his bed there, it just makes it to where it's kind of a null point. There's not too much to be able to go off of. But this reenacting of the incident of the murder of his sister is fascinating in that he also mentions the blunt object trauma to the head, which wasn't discovered until later in an autopsy, because initially when finding JonBenet, the immediate cause of death, as I already mentioned, was strangulation. And then once the autopsy was carried out, they found evidence of the blunt force trauma. So there are some complexities that are in here. Let's continue.
Tell you about your sister dying.
We're just when I got there to the house for the kind of angle type thing. But my dad said, John isn't heaven now.
Mm-hmm.
Just got burst into tears.
Oh, bad. How are you dealing with it now?
I kind of forget about it because I'm just going,
You're just playing your video games all the time.
Go.
So during the time where he's talking about the interaction with him and his father telling him that JonBenet is dead, he's doing a little playful head bob along with that, which shows a level of nonchalantness about the story itself. So we're seeing that non-verbally in there. It's fairly dismissive of the weight of the situation, and then it comes back around. He says that he burst into tears. I'm not certain on that. There's no external evidence on that. There's no other eyewitnesses on that. And there's not too much to be able to go off of with this little statement to say, oh, he didn't burst into tears. How dare he say that? There's nothing like that either. So we'll just take that he did burst into tears at that moment. But then right after that, he counteracts it and says, I don't know, I oftentimes or sometimes just completely forget about it because I'm so focused on playing my video games. Is he dissociating? Is this how he deals with a traumatic event? Or is it because he wasn't actually very perturbed about his sister's death and he wasn't curious about what happened with it because he knew these things to begin with? There's also evidence of a phone call that his voice might be at the end of, semi-implicating himself in the case, which has been disproven and proven by different experts, and so that's also muddy. And then there was also trace DNA found on JonBenet's undergarments, which people then are saying it's not attached to somebody within the family, but even that trace DNA was found to be inconclusive and even possibly so minute that it could have been like a factory worker's DNA who was at the factory that created the undergarments. So it was so minute and so complex that even that was not able to be submitted as evidence in the case. So we've got so many of these extra tidbits of details floating around that all that it does is end up muddying things a little bit more. So we'll try to focus on what we can concretely see here and know here as best as possible as we go through this.
But let's take a break. Maybe you could draw your picture of your family for me while you help with that. We can't draw. Let's do that. It's not a test of your drawing. Just so I get to know your family and stuff like that. So the first person you would draw would be who?
Oh, I got one.
Okay. So who's next? Who would you draw next? Mom. Okay. So what's your mom do? She work out.
Work as a mom.
Work as a mom. So what do you like best about your mom?
Movies.
That's it?
Okay, so now we're hearing a little bit. The audio and video quality is it's so hard to deal with, but I guess it is what it is. So right now he's trying to draw out his family, and he draws his dad first. Now he's drawing his mom. He's being asked about his mom, and his response to the question of what do you like about your mom is she's nice and more, which I find that fascinating as well, but it does make sense contextually with the attention imbalance that existed within that family. Patsy did pay a lot more attention to JonBenet and doted a lot more upon her than she did upon Burke, so Burke would likely not feel as lovey-dovey towards his mother as perhaps JonBenet would have, because that's not the relationship that he was able to have with his mother. So his mother was nice and more, I guess, according to Burke. So that does make sense contextually, but now we're going to continue through as he's drawing this little picture here.
Was your mom the kind of mom that just watched the
Yep.
Both you and your sister, just you, or just you? Anybody else in your family? Like you, or your mom?
About me.
What about you?
So what went through your...
All right, gotta go ahead and pause there to clarify as to the rest of that. He never drew JonBenet in the family, and he never mentioned JonBenet for the family dynamic. Do want to make note, he does say that Patsy did hug and kiss both him and his sister. He doesn't say whether it was balanced or anything along those lines. Evidence kind of points towards the contrary of that, but Patsy did love both of her children. That does make sense. And honestly, throughout all of this, I never had a moment of thinking that Patsy did anything to cause JonBenet's death. She never showed me any indicators of guilt. There were areas that she did blow a little bit of smoke, especially when it came to the matter of handwriting analysis and whether or not certain letters that did obviously match didn't match, things along those lines. So there were areas of weaseliness that she did do. But even in those areas of weaseliness, I did not see her as being a guilty party as far as carrying out the crime itself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as it goes on, but psychologists, including the one that was in the room at the time, found it very fascinating that Burke did not add JonBenet to his drawing. Now, there's the possibility that he didn't add her because now in his mind, she's gone, she's dead, so she's not going to be included in the picture. But even with that, what psychologists pointed out then is that it shows an immediate detachment from his relationship with his sister. JonBenet was gone, and then for Burke, that just meant that she was no longer, she had nothing to do with anything. That level of detachment struck many as suspicious. It still strikes many as suspicious today. Now we're in a different series of interactions here a little bit later. With a different person, obviously, and there's still some more to be able to establish, so let's watch through it.
So what went through your mind there?
And then I thought, maybe JonBenet is saying, but that's not that likely. So, what are the chances of that happening?
Is there anything about that night, if you can remember hearing anything during the night?
I don't remember hearing anything, because I was sleeping. I always sleep real deeply and I can never hear anything.
All right, so that's that point that was mentioned in the little backstory portion where he's saying that he always sleeps real deeply and I never hear anything. Statement analysis people have pointed out the need to add that real and never in there to try to hammer home that point. Along with that, in the prior videos, when I mentioned this portion of the case, the hearing of anything, what I pointed out was that Burke's room is very much on the top floor, and all of this was said to occur on the bottom floors, possibly even the basement, which there would be multiple floors of separation. So I was assuming that there would be so much space in between the two that any noise heard in the basement couldn't be heard on the top floor. That would be the case, except that there was a ventilation system that they tested this whole theory on whether or not he could or couldn't have heard what was happening downstairs, upstairs. And there was every possibility of hearing anything down in the basement due to this ventilation system. It more or less served as a telephone system to convey any sounds that were going on down there through the vents up to whatever room of the house, more or less. And there were even some reports of neighbors reporting hearing a scream from outside of the house. So this concept of Burke not hearing it is less likely. Perhaps he is an extremely hard sleeper and he just slept through all of it. That is definitely a possibility. I wasn't able to find any other evidence outside of that that really supported or denied that claim that he was a super heavy sleeper. But just the separation alone is no longer available as an excuse for not being able to hear due to that ventilation system. Wanted to make note of that as we're continuing through this because all information is good information. Let's continue watching.
Was you ever go downstairs in the basement play?
Yeah, I had a electric train there.
How about the last year you lived there? Did you play there much?
Sort of.
No, when you go to bed at night.
That's a very, very, very long pause to think about whether or not you played in a place that he had immediately knew about or was able to recollect and talk about the electric train that he enjoyed down in the basement. And to me, that long of a pause strikes me as interesting. It's not a pause that's necessary to remember whether or not you played in an area of a house that you admitted to playing in before. I find that fascinating. There's not too much around that to be able to say anything. We're also seeing some more overt self-soothing gestures as he's starting to manipulate down around there. That could be a sign of that agitation being calmed down. But there's still more to go through here.
Bed at night. What was your normal routine? I mean, would you eat a snack before you went to bed?
I might get a snack.
So that I don't know. I wasn't able to see when he said the I don't know. I could only see shortly thereafter. But the I don't know that he responds, the force behind his words has dropped off substantially and the pitch itself has fallen a bit. That could indicate a level of insecurity with what's being said, a lack of certainty perhaps. And the words themselves, I don't know, also obviously indicate that. So he's saying that, and then he does a pretty overt self-soothing manipulator with his pants there. It's a preening gesture. It's being aware of how you're appearing or how you're being perceived. So he does that shortly after that question of, did you usually have a snack before bed? Now, for anybody else not involved in this case, that is a very innocent question. There's no reason to really get caught up in it. That's not the case with this specific situation because of the element of the pineapple, which was Burke's favorite snack, being found in JonBenet's stomach when she was dead. And so that snack suddenly goes from being really inconsequential to being very important, and he starts showing a little bit of agitation around that. I do find that fascinating. It makes sense for multiple contexts, so let's just watch through.
Not usually.
If you got a snack, what would you not get? Or what would mom let you have?
Pudding or yogurt.
Pudding yogurt. Some parents let kids have cookies and candy and cereal, fruit.
So this interviewer, I'm assuming he's another psychologist that's interacting with Burke here, is much more clever with the way that he's asking these questions. He's asking in such a way that is building rapport with Burke, but then he's asking and he's trying to gently guide Burke into these areas of possibly admitting some level of detail or knowledge of detail that might be more implicative. It's clever. It also raises into question the morality of these form of interrogation techniques being used on children and all of the complications that go into that, because it is a very complicated situation. And unfortunately, and I'm sure that this psychologist found himself wrestling with this morally throughout it, is that you might not want to do that sort of thing to a child. But if a child is possibly complicit in a crime, then you have to, for the sake of the person who has already passed. So it gets really complicated. But what the psychologist is doing currently is trying to get Burke to admit that he likes pineapple a lot, that would be his favorite thing. So he goes from, what did you eat at night? What kind of snack? Oh, it would be pudding or yogurt. Cool. A lot of parents say blah, blah, blah. What about fruit? Do you like any fruit? Specifically anywhere. It's not that overt, but you could see it happening here.
Things like that.
I said, yeah, she would suggest fruit.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of fruits would you typically have it on?
Like pineapple, maybe.
Yeah, do you like that?
Yeah.
Is that your favorite fruit?
Tongue.
What was JonBenet's favorite snack?
He's starting to feel uncomfortable around this pineapple element, which again, that has to be for a number of reasons. There's a couple possibilities. Either one, it's because he's complicit in the crime, and perhaps JonBenet did in fact take his pineapple, and he knows that he reacted very overtly and aggressively and did damage to JonBenet. He's behaving as if he's reluctant to admit any relation to pineapple if it's in regards to this case. The other possibility is that he knows that everybody has talked about the pineapple. Kids are very well aware of what adults talk about, oftentimes more so than the adults are aware of them being aware of. So perhaps he also just knew that people were suspicious of this pineapple facet of things, so he didn't want to talk about it too much. But he quickly says that he likes pineapple, and then if it's his favorite, he closes in a little bit and covers his mouth, which is a fairly telling mouth-blocking gesture, and does some postural rechanging again, and has that drop-off of force and pitch behind his voice again when centered around this pineapple. That's two different moments when it's talking about this pineapple that if an adult had been behaving this way, it would be a very overt red flag. Again, because of its complexity and that it's a child's development that we're working with here, I'm less likely to want to immediately be like, this is a huge red flag. So we're seeing these red flags start to pop up. They're tentative, and they are in fairly telling areas of these interviews, but there's a little bit more to be able to go through.
His favorite snack?
I don't think she has.
What about pineapple? Did she like that?
Yeah, she liked pineapple.
What did you do next?
Laid in bed, my eyes closed, tried to get to sleep. How wondering.
Obviously, that cuts there, and now we're in a different day. Burke's wearing a different outfit, so probably a different day. I'm gonna assume that they weren't just like, all right, go ahead and head out the door, change your clothes, and come back in, and we're gonna do this again. That would be weird. Burke's in a different outfit. We're on a different day, so there's gonna be some emotional reset from that to begin with. But then from the time before, the psychologist did at least have Burke admit that JonBenet did really like pineapple, and Burke did fairly willingly just release that information, which then, for context, allows us to think back onto the time where he was having difficulty admitting it before. It just adds muddiness to it a little bit, so we'll continue watching.
How wondering something bad happened. Something bad happened. But what? Let's try and think of what. When?
So you're curious.
Yeah.
And you're curious about something. What do you not do?
Try to find out what the answer is.
Did you do that after Mom came into the room?
No, I figured somebody would probably come in and tell me. Or I would find out later in the day.
Can you tell me what this to
I'm going to go ahead and pause here. So we're seeing a lot of manipulators around Burke's mouth. He's doing a lot of manipulating on the inside of his mouth with his tongue. He's also, you could see his smile coming in, which in his later interview, he had a continuous smile throughout the entirety of his interview, which could be related to likely nerves. To have that consistent of a smile throughout an interview, it can't be related as closely to something like duping delight or anything along those lines due to its longevity is more or less it. So we see that coming out here, letting us know that perhaps he started learning this smile response to nervousness at an earlier age, and other people did point out that in that JonBenet was in these shows and Patsy was in these shows where the smiling is a large portion of it, and the mindset, the mantra of smile through the pain or through the discomfort is very much present in that arena of things. Perhaps that bled over some to Burke as well. We're also seeing very overt self-soothing gestures in a number of other areas here on his legs. He's fidgeting. He's less comfortable overall with this scenario and this specific psychologist than he was with the initial psychologists right shortly after the actual incident itself. We're working with partial information as best as we can here, so we'll continue through.
this to choose?
That the dining room table.
Can you describe that to me?
So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. The picture that came over the screen there, that's the one that he's being shown there. It's in black and white in there, but it's still that picture of the pineapple with milk and a cup of tea, which was his favorite snack. And so Burke sees the picture, and you could see that the very overt thing in the middle of the picture is the focus of it, but he says it's the dining room table. And so perhaps there's a level of an attempt to divert attention from the actual source of the picture itself, the focus of it, but we're about to see this play out a little bit more.
Didn't go along. Something.
Hi.
So that's a moment that a lot of people are cued in on. It's a bowl of, and he stares for a very long time. You could see a manipulator coming in under his sleeve as he's grasping there. That's a sign of agitation and perhaps nervousness. And then he says, oh, in realization as to what it is. And then he backpedals and says, something. So that, to many people, even statement analyses, it strikes people as fascinating. Why does he very obviously recognize what the object of the picture is and then try to backpedal out of it, if not for the fact that there's something that is hinging around that dish, perhaps? Again, if we're looking at it in the lens of JonBenet was found with pineapple in her stomach, it was Burke's favorite snack. This was found on the table from the night before where Burke was having his favorite snack. Perhaps there was a taking situation and a loss of control due to anger, and Burke flashed out towards JonBenet. There's that distinct possibility, and this all seems to line up with it fairly well. Let's continue watching, and we'll talk a little bit about everything across all of the different videos that I've done here at the end of this one. So let's watch.
Hi.
Looks like glass she dang in it.
Does that look like cereal inside there?
Wow.
Or does it look like
a little big white piece right there? Mm-hmm. Maybe like broke or throwing a spoon.
What did you really find out?
So going to go ahead and pause there. The overt amount of agitation that comes into Burke's nonverbal communication when looking at that photo and talking about what it could be. Even the psychologist tries to get him to admit what it could or couldn't be. Burke's trying to play that he doesn't know what's in this bowl or that it's unidentifiable. One, it's very clear in the photo what it is, but then along with that, he would know that snack. It was one of his favorite snacks, the pineapple, milk, and tea. And so people are then very suspicious as to why he's trying to play off that he has no idea. What strikes me as fascinating is he handles the identification of this dish the same way that John and Patsy handled the very obvious matching handwriting samples from the ransom note to other areas that Patsy had written down things. And so both of those scenarios have this area of like, it's very obvious to anybody watching and looking and seeing the evidence that they're looking at, but they are trying very hard to make it seem as if it's a mystery or unrelated at all. I do find that fascinating, and oftentimes children will reflect the nonverbal communication and some of the verbal and psychological patterns of their parents. That's both born into them, but that's also then observed and learned. So possibly we're seeing some similar patterns there as well. Let's continue through the last little bit of this.
That JonBenet was dead.
When I was at the Franny's house, and I saw him real sad. Your dad on me said, JonBenet in heaven.
What did you do?
Started crying.
What do you remember about that? About JonBenet getting dead or wedding?
Okay, so again, this is two different areas now that Burke has said that in this moment everybody was looking sad, and then he was told that JonBenet was dead or in heaven, and he started crying. He said that at the beginning, in the early interviews, and he said this what would be a few years later in this interview as well. So to me, having that sort of consistency across time in a child, to me, pushes me to believe that perhaps he did at that moment cry. Now, whether or not that was because of his actual feelings of loss, perhaps it could also be an emotional response to the trauma of the entire situation. Again, if Burke did this out of anger, lost control and reacted poorly and accidentally harmed his sister, even though he was not a big fan of JonBenet, perhaps he was jealous of JonBenet, whatever reasons for it, that instance of losing control and doing something like that would still be a traumatic event to even experience as the child doing it. So the crying response to that could still be a genuine response regardless of his complicity in the actual scenario itself. So we're still left with a little bit of muddiness here. There's only a last little blip of this, and then we'll talk.
JonBenet getting dead or wedding pants.
And she wet her bed.
What would happen when JonBenet would wear her bed? What would mom or dad do?
Mom would change the sheets, all that stuff, and Dad don't do anything. He had to go work.
Okay, and that was another, that lets us know a little bit of the family dynamic that was going on there. The dad was fairly removed. His job was to provide. He would go to work, and he was not really involved in the raising of the children, and that wasn't unheard of, especially for that time. With JonBenet wetting the bed, this gives us a little bit of a glimpse from Burke's perspective as to how the parents handle intense interactions between the parents and kids. A child wetting the bed, a poorly handled response to it could be anger from a parent, could be a level of lashing out from the parent, and that would give us a little bit of insight as to what that parent-to-child dynamic was. But according to Burke, it seemed as though Patsy would just kind of clean it up and be there, and it would be fine, because really it's not a big deal. It's just a wet bed. But seeing that from Burke lets us know that, at very least, Patsy wasn't the type to lash out regularly towards JonBenet. And in my mind, that again even pushes further towards clearing Patsy in all of this. I don't believe that Patsy did anything. Now, at my other videos, what I had ended up landing on, due to some of the details in the ransom note, the length of the ransom note, some of the materials used for that note, some of the timeline features, even down to the snow outside. Some people were like, oh, well, you could see, we all saw the crime scene evidence photos that the snow was all melted away and people could have easily gotten in. That wasn't the case before. The week before, again, I looked at the weather during that time. It was snowy and cold, so the snow would have melted in time for the police to take those pictures. That wouldn't have been what the snow was like on the actual event itself. So we're seeing some difficulties around that as well. All of this still pushing towards somebody within the family, within the household, doing this crime. And so some people say, oh, well, there was somebody who was seen out lurking around and had blonde hair and had possibly been able to break in at a time when they weren't there and then waited. And there is that distinct possibility. But then what many people are questioning then is, how did this random lurker outside know these specific details about the father's bonus? The amount asked in the note was the exact amount that John's bonus was. So how would somebody have known that unless they had insider knowledge on that? Could have been a very, very lucky guess. $118,000 could have, I guess, been a very lucky guess. Very unlikely to just randomly guess that. People are more likely to request rounded off numbers. I want $150,000. I want $100,000, something along those lines. Not, I want $118,000 that just so happens to match with the bonus that you have. There's the possibility that they knew that and then they used that as a red herring because they shouldn't have known that. There's all sorts of possibilities around that. What seems to me is that it has to be somebody within the family. I had landed on John, but after going through and digging a little bit more on Burke and seeing some of these behavioral issues and the different ways that they manifested, seeing some of his behaviors in response to the stimulus of the scenario itself, it seems less insane, for lack of a better word. It seems less insane for Burke to have gotten angry and lashed out at JonBenet, even accidentally causing severe damage to her, possibly killing her, and then the family, the parents, which we've seen, they will come in and speak on behalf of their child, even lightly twisting some of the facts to clear their child. They came in, saw the situation, thought to themselves, I can't lose another child. We just lost our child. I can't lose the other one too. So they covered it up and tried to make it look as if perhaps it was this weird attempted kidnapping. Another facet that pushes against the kidnapping is that it's very, very rare for a person to have a kidnapping and then leave the kidnapped victim in the house and then leave the ransom note for that kidnapping in the same house with the unkidnapped victim. That alone isn't the way that kidnappings would. They kidnap, they take, and then they go, they leave the ransom note behind, and if they're going to kill, they kill elsewhere. They don't kill in the same place as the initial kidnapping occurred. And if they did kill in the same place as the kidnapping occurred, why would they then leave a ransom note? There wouldn't be a need for that. Did they sit down and write a 3-page note and then go and kill JonBenet and then bounce and just get out of there, leaving almost no evidence? There was no evidence of a break-in, and there was no evidence around the yard of somebody being able to break in. So did they just do a phenomenal job at getting in and out without being noticed? There's a slew of questions around that. What seems to fit the theories most is that Burke lost control, hurt or possibly killed JonBenet. Parents covered it up. And because of that cover-up, we're seeing Patsy have an awful time. Her favorite child is gone, and possibly at the hands of her other child that she then had to cover for everything. And so the interviews that we've seen where she is drugged out of her mind trying to make it through this would make sense. And along with that, throughout the other interviews, I didn't see any areas of her showing indicators of guilt around the actual scenario, where there were a whole slew of indicators of guilt around the leaving of the note and the handwriting analysis that they underwent around that. all of that lines up to two parents trying desperately to fix a situation that would be horrifically tragic in general. So those are my reasons. That's my theory. That's where I'm at now. I've given you multiple videos to be able to kind of mull it over with. If you've watched all those videos and you have some other thoughts to be able to add to this, please let me know in the comments below. If you would like to be able to see more videos on this case specifically, or any other case, let me know in the comments as well. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, do all those different things. But without further ado, that's all that I've got for today. My name is Logan, and you've been oh so awesome as you always are, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.